Welcome back, guys. Well, it's official. We have reached the fourth standard in our eight new standards. That means we are halfway done. Give yourself a pat on the back. In today's module, we are going to be covering numerical reasoning standard 4. Just a reminder, over the next 2 years, we'll be participating in professional learning with the goal of understanding these new standards. And by school year 2023, we will begin with full implementation. One of the things we'll begin working on as a county will be assessments for these new standards. Be on the lookout for the questions at the end of each module. From here on out, you're going to be asked to submit a sample test question that goes with the standards being covered. A big question I want you to ask yourself is, how do your students approach math? Do they like it? Are they excited? Are they engaged? I love this quote about math. Good mathematics is not about how many answers you know. It's about how you behave when you don't know. It truly encourages a growth mindset about math. This mindset is essential for understanding and learning mathematics. As we go through these standards, please think about how each of the mathematical practices could be utilized in a lesson. Just a reminder, standards 1 and 6 should be present in pretty much all math tasks, but particularly with fractions, Math Practice 4 will be seen quite frequently. Model with mathematics. Numerical reasoning encompasses everything from place value rounding, comparison, addition, subtraction, multiplicative comparison, multiplication and division of whole numbers, as well as fraction equivalences, comparison of fractions, and addition and subtraction of fractions with like denominators. So far, we have covered NR1 and 2. This module will focus on NR4. Note that there is not an NR3. The standards are listed numerically. For example, NR1, NR2, PAR3, NR4. In every module, I will include this learning progression. It's important to note the vertical progression of the standards. In this module, we will be covering the highlighted concepts. Be sure to pause the video now and review the learning progressions for these key concepts before moving forward. Let's review the standards document. The standard will always be found at the top of the document with the expectations or substandards and evidence of learning below. Just a reminder, the evidence of learning is going to be very helpful when planning for instruction. Within this standard, each expectation has examples in the evidence for learning. This is going to be especially helpful when planning for instruction as well as finding resources. NR4 is very similar to our current NF1, 2, and 3 standards. But there is one key difference. Multiplying fractions, our current NF4, has been removed from 4th grade. All right, guys, let's dive in. NR4, Expectation 1, use concrete materials, drawings, and number lines. Demonstrate and explain the relationship between equivalent fractions, including fractions greater than 1, and explain the identity property of multiplication as it relates to equivalent fractions. Generate equivalent fractions using these relationships. This expectation includes fractions greater than 1, and denominators should be limited to denominators of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 100. I really like that this standard is explicit in the fact that it says using concrete materials, drawings, number lines. This is going to give students a great chance to use visual models to represent fractions, which will help them gain a deeper understanding of the fractions as they continue to learn different processes with them. Students should have access to those concrete materials I mentioned before, like fraction tiles, when being introduced to this standard. They also need to be familiar with using a number line to solve problems like the one included. Students can make connections to multiplication to create equivalent fractions. These are all processes that students are going to need to know in order to solve the operations of fractions, not just in 4th grade, but also moving forward in 5th grade when they start looking at unlike denominators. NR4, expectation 2. Compare two fractions with the same numerator or the same denominator by reasoning about their size and recognize that comparisons are valid only when the two fractions refer to the same whole. Still using common denominators as a base for fraction knowledge, students will be able to compare fractions with those common numerators or common denominators. Students must understand this skill before they compare fractions with unlike denominators and unlike numerators. This sets the prerequisite for expectation 3. If students can complete successfully expectation 2, if they master it, then they are ready to move on to expectation 3. It's kind of like the old adage, you've got to crawl before you walk. Students need to understand how to compare fractions with those like numerators and denominators before they can go on to comparing with unlike numerators and denominators. Would You Rather has been such a popular game in my classroom this year. My kids beg to play it. Completing activities like the one included when learning comparison creates a really high interest environment, but it also is real world applicable. You could even have students create their own problems after solving one like the one in the module. Check out the QR code included. It's a really great resource. It really goes into detail about common misconceptions students have when comparing fractions. NR4, expectation 3. Compare two fractions with different numerators and or different denominators by flexibly using a variety of tools and strategies, and recognize that comparisons are only valid when the two fractions refer to the same whole, i.e., like denominators. Also, let's note, flexibly is used in this. That means the whole goal is students can use fraction models. They can create common denominators or numerators, or they can even compare to a benchmark fraction. Using the butterfly method is not an appropriate trick to teach students this skill. This causes misconceptions in how to create a common denominator, which will ultimately directly impact them in math, but also in math in 4th grade, but also when they go to 5th grade. We want them to understand fractions and how they're made up, and how when you do create a common denominator, it's not changing the value of the fraction. And a lot of times when they use tricks, they just simply memorize the trick and they don't understand the skill. This example was pulled straight from the standards documents, and it's compare 5/6 and 7/8. Doesn't get much more straightforward than that. Students can use strategies like visual fraction models, creating common denominators or numerators, or comparing to a benchmark fraction. One of my favorite ways to compare to a benchmark fraction is to use a number line. I've seen this done in a multitude of ways. Typically, we use our whiteboards and draw number lines on them. We'll draw 2 number lines on them to compare the fractions. I also know a teacher who laminated blank number lines for her kids, and also half number lines and 4th number lines for her kids. And so they would use those to compare their fractions. Anything that is tangible that the kids can get their hands on, that the students can get their hands on, is going to be helpful in them retaining this information and understanding it at a deep conceptual level. And that's the goal. We want them to understand why the numbers work the way they do. NR4, expectation 4. Represent whole numbers and fractions using the sum of unit fractions. Students will need a firm understanding and decomposition of whole numbers and fractions into unit fractions as a prerequisite for this skill. By this point, students should have several strategies under their belt when the standard is taught. This basically means that they will be able to solve this problem in different ways. Students should have the flexibility to choose the strategy that allows them to make sense of the problem. So what's right for one student might not be what's right from the other, but it is important that they get to see you model a variety of strategies as you're teaching these skills so that they can pick and find which one works best for them and the way their mind works. NR4, expectation 5. Represent a fraction as a sum of fractions with the same denominator in more than one way, recording with an equation. One of the examples from the standards document talks about cutting a piece of ribbon for a classroom art project, but I jumped straight to birthday cake. And as a child, it was really important to me that the birthday cake was cut up equally. And students could take something like that and turn it into that real world equation where they come up with the way you would find out how to cut the cake up for a certain number of people. This is one of those standards that is very real life and real world applicable, because cutting things in half or breaking things apart is very common practice. I think that's why using a chocolate bar is such a common example when talking about fractions. And this is the standard that you want to pull out those Hershey bars for. Clearly, I'm all about fractions in food. It's such a great way to increase engagement of students because, brownies, pizza, cake, those are all things that they typically love. In this example, students are cutting up pans of brownies and they're trying to figure out how many eighths of brownies are left. And the key to this example that I want to note is that it says show a mathematical representation of the brownies that are left. And one way they could show that would be by physically drawing the pans of brownies and then shading how many of the brownies have been sold. NR4, expectation 6. Add and subtract fractions and mixed numbers with like denominators using a variety of tools. With this standard, manipulatives like Cuisenaire rods, drawings, and numbers can be very useful tools to solve. Students should be really flexible in their choice of strategy, but it is important that students can solve addition and subtraction of fractions and mixed numbers by using and understanding a variety of strategies. That basically means that students can do it in a multitude of ways. The example that's included here is one that was found on Open Middle from Robert Kaplansky, which is the king of 3-act tasks. I've included that as a resource before, and I'm also including this website for you guys to check out as a resource as well. This would be an example of a very high rigor problem. It could be a really great warm-up for kids, or I could even see it as a culminating task when you're getting to the end of teaching this expectation. It says using the digits 1 to 9 at most one time, place each digit in the box to make a true equation with the smallest possible sum. It gives them hints, and then it will ultimately, if they click on it, it will give them the answer. I actually am currently teaching adding and subtracting mixed numbers, so I shared a link to some of my kids today to do this as a challenge problem, and I will tell you, it got them thinking, which I love. That's what we want. We want that rigor in our classrooms. So one of the things that's going to be asked at the end of this, not only are you going to be asked about submitting some test questions, I also want you guys to see if you can find anything kind of similar to Open Middle as a digital resource that we could potentially bank and share with the teachers in our county moving forward. Okay, guys, this is access to those DOE resources like the learning progression chart, the summary of changes in the standards, as well as a list of the K-8 standards. So if you have any questions about standard placement, that's a really good document to look at. These are a few resources that you might find helpful when planning for instruction. Robert Kaplansky's 3-act tasks, Open Middle, which is the website that last example came from, and then Math Coaches Corner, which is the website that the example about the pizza Would You Rather came from. She also has other resources, and her blog is really, really great. If you guys have any resources, please share at the end. I would love to be able to really compile a list of really great websites that create that high rigor math environment that I know we're all striving to cultivate in our classrooms. Major takeaways: ditch the tricks. Butterfly method is a no-go. No more multiplying fractions. Woohoo! Visual fraction models are going to be the key to conceptual understanding, particularly in the beginning of learning this fraction standard and going through the expectations. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at leads@bullockschools.org.